The work that we're presenting today is being conducted as part of the Survey Futures programme. So just a few words about that for those of you that are less familiar with the Survey Futures programme. So it's essentially a research programme which is focused on ensuring that large-scale surveys in the UK can innovate and adapt in a changing environment so that it remains possible to carry out high-quality surveys going forward. And it's funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, and essentially is a collaboration between academics based in 9 different universities, the 3 major survey agencies in the UK, so NatSen, Ipsos and Verian, and also involved in the partnership of a National Centre for Research Methods and the Office for National Statistics. And the programme involves a wide variety of researchers from all of these different institutions, covering a whole range of different research strands, each focused on different aspects of survey research. And you can find out a lot more about the Survey Futures programme on the website, which I encourage you to visit. On the website, you'll find all of the outputs and publications from all of the different research strands, and information about other upcoming events, which are both online and in person. So the work that we're focusing on today is being conducted as part of Research Strand 5, which is a package of projects which are investigating how best to go about measuring more complex measurements via online self-completion surveys. So lots of the phenomena that we want to capture information about can be quite complex, and so working out how to do this effectively in online surveys is, which we're all making use of more and more, is critical. And we're focusing on 4 particular types of complex measure in this work package. So we're looking at how best to go about doing industry and occupation coding, how best to go about collecting consent to administrative data linkage, measuring cognition, and the focus of today, how best to go about collecting retrospective information about past life events. So I'm going to hand over to Christian now, who's going to talk through our findings from an evidence review which we've recently published, where we've looked into how different studies have gone about measuring collecting retrospective information online, and some of the pros and cons of the different approaches which have been used, and the practical implications of each of these different methods. Christian's going to talk for half an hour or so, so we look forward to there being plenty of time left for discussion. So, but for now, over to you, Christian.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christian Domarchi. I'm a research fellow based at the University of Southampton, and I have been working in the Survey Futures projects for over a year and a half already. So this is one of the topics we have been covering as part of Research Strand 5 of the project, as Matt was saying before. The motivation for studying this is obviously that the study of life events, the sequence, interconnections, and their impact on individual and social outcomes has been a long-standing area of interest across various disciplines. So it's a very varied field. The problem is that information about these events often needs to be gathered retrospectively, which means relying on participants' memory, making retrospective data collection susceptible to errors such as event omissions, reporting inconsistencies, and that kind of thing. So this is the main challenge that we find when trying to collect this type of data. We are here today to present actually 2 outputs from the research we conducted on this specific topic as part of Research Strand 5 of Survey Futures. So first, we have an evidence review which synthesizes methods for retrospective data collection in self-administered online surveys. So we are focusing specifically on that mode. The review includes academic papers, conference presentations, technical reports of surveys, other published literature, all in English. So there's that tiny limitation, as we will see a bit later. And we focus on survey design practices that may help optimizing retrospective data collection methods for self-completion. I have to say, though, that I will start complaining already. The amount of literature available about this specific topic, so retrospective data collection for online self-completion surveys, is still rather limited. So we are not in a position from the literature that we reviewed to provide specific recommendations and saying this method is always preferable to this other method, or this has been experimentally tested and we have concluded that this is the best way to go about collecting data. Rather than collecting retrospective data, we are focusing on looking at each method, trying to see what the advantages are, the disadvantages, pros and cons, and kind of recommendations if a specific survey wants to go to a specific method to collect this type of data. We are not including here time use surveys and that kind of thing, which has a very different focus. It's still retrospective data collection, but this is out of scope of this review. So I just want to say that before we go into the methods themselves. So this is the first output of this research strand. It's already available in the Survey Futures website, and there's a QR code there. And we are very happy because recently we have also published a survey practice guide, which is now available on the Survey Futures website as well. This is it's a condensed version of the evidence review, so it has a brief summary of each method, but the focus here is on pros and cons, wider considerations, and practical recommendations for implementation for each method. So it's using summary tables to present this information. So it's very friendly. It's a short document as well. So it should be, we hope at least, that it's helpful for people who want to collect this type of data in their surveys. So that's also available in the website, and there's a QR code there if you want to have a look. And I'll be including some of the summary tables for each method as I go through the presentation. Okay, so as I was saying, classifying these methods for retrospective data collection is a bit tricky given the evidence that we have. Also, we have methods that overlap. So we have different methods that share common characteristics. And we also have non-standardized definitions. So we have, for example, the most typical method for collecting retrospective data is retrospective calendars. They are referred to as with different terminology across the different studies. So we have tried, for the purposes of the evidence review and the survey practice guide, to conduct a classification of all the methods available, and we are grouping them across two key dimensions. This is rather arbitrary, but it helped us in the analysis that we did and the review of the literature, but other classifications might be more suitable, but in this case, this is what we implemented. So the first criteria is the time span. So we have a very distinctive approach for collecting long-term retrospective data, or life histories, as we are calling them here. They cover obviously the full lifespan of the respondent, so from birth to the present moment. And we are calling short-term, could be short or medium-term if you want, the instruments that cover shorter periods, typically interwave periods between waves of longitudinal surveys, or slightly longer periods, for example, the education period of a specific respondent that doesn't cover the full lifespan of the respondent, and we are calling these event histories. So that's one criteria of classification. And the other main criteria is the visual layout. So there's a distinctive group of instruments for retrospective data collection that includes retrospective calendars, which is a visual grid format to enable simultaneous visualization of several domains. I will talk about this a bit later on, either to directly input events or as a visualization aid that supplements a questionnaire. We have that, and we also, and to complete these retrospective calendars, people are being asked a series of questions that then allow them to complete all the fields in the respective calendar. But we also have a questionnaire-based approaches that do not include calendars, could include other types of visual aids, but not necessarily calendars. So that's the main classification that we use. I've included this figure just for clarification. So basically, if we have a visual layout of a calendar, we are talking about retrospective calendars, which is, as I was saying, a chronological grid format with time units on one axis, life domains on the other. Visual layout enhances memory recall. So that's the key thing about retrospective calendars, the key feature and the most important characteristics. However, most applications have been interviewer administered. So there's the unknown or the slightly less known question about whether these are still effective for online self-administration. And on the other hand, we have questionnaire-based approaches. As I was saying, retrospective calendars still need questions to be completed, so it's a bit of an overlap here. But with questionnaire-based approaches, we are thinking about questions that are asked to participants about their past in several domains. They are asked sequentially, with respondents required to recall events from the most recent to the most distant, or vice versa, but without the actual presence of a calendar to help them. There might be other visual aids, but no calendars. So, and we have the short term and the long term. So for the short term, we have event history calendars and life history calendars here. And for the short term, in questionnaire-based approaches, we have mainly conventional questionnaires, but there's also other things like dependent interviewing and event-triggered data collection, which have been used in several surveys, which we will also briefly review a bit later on. But we'll start with life history calendars because that's a really interesting way for collecting this type of data. So as I was mentioning before, they capture complete life histories, which are understood as a series of significant and interrelated events occurring to individuals across several domains over the complete lifespan. Domains can include things like education, employment history, family events, relationships and partnerships, fertility history, places of residence, all that kind of thing that allows you to build a full life history of the respondent. And yeah, these are typically used in initial interviews for longitudinal or cohort surveys. So it's very interesting to have information about the full life history of the respondent. I did say that the literature is relatively limited when talking about retrospective data collection for online surveys, but it's not limited when we talk about interviewer-administered life history calendars. There's a whole body of literature that has basically shown that life history calendars can facilitate access to autobiographical memory for life history data collection in 3 ways. So first, landmark events in the calendar can act as temporal anchoring points. So by remembering one specific event in the calendar, people are prompted to remember other things across other different life domains. So that can be helpful for them from a visual perspective. Also, the calendar enables the sequencing of events and presents them graphically, helping respondents to contextualize them and reducing the risk of omissions. So that's another thing. Calendars, the visualization in the calendars may allow respondents to reduce omitted events or to remember all the full sequence for every domain. And the visual nature of the calendar allows respondents and interviewers to link episodes across life domains, encouraging top-down and parallel retrieval. So this is very important. Interviewer-led life history calendars have proven effective for collecting life histories compared to conventional questionnaires. But this is mainly because traditionally these calendars have been applied, have been used as an aid for a conversation between the interviewer and the respondent. So basically there's a lot of interaction and building of rapport that can help respondents to remember certain events and to complete the calendar in a fluid conversation with the interviewer. And that has been proven more effective than just conventional questionnaires in which questions are asked sequentially. Also, the interviewer can jump from one specific time to another and from one domain to the other. And this flexibility allows the calendar to be very successful in collecting this kind of data. However, and I will come back to this later in the presentation, but the evidence on the effectiveness of these types of calendars for online self-administration is rather limited, as I was saying. There are interesting examples on how these have been implemented in practice, but we still lack some more experimental, more formal comparisons between all the methods that are available. So online self-administered life history calendars can be completed as respondents answer questions about specific domains and events. And there's a whole range of different calendars that can be used and different methods for inputting the information into the calendar. But we have classified all these methods in two main groups. So the calendar can be used first as a visual representation of answers provided by the respondent. So in this case, the respondents cannot directly edit the calendar by clicking on them, and any edits or changes must be done directly in each question screen. So basically, in this case, the calendar is shown as a visualization of the information that the respondent has provided in the responses to the questions. But also the calendar itself can be a responsive tool for data entry. In this case, respondents can directly add and edit information by clicking, dragging, and interacting with the calendar, with the appropriate area of the calendar in a more direct way. However, in both cases, the calendar is used as an aid to simultaneously visualize events across several life domains and over time. So it's hoped that the visualization of all these simultaneous domains over time is what triggers participants to remember events, to relate one domain to the other, and basically to reduce the possibility of forgetting about events or omission or basically inconsistencies as well. That can also happen. In the evidence review, we talk about 2 UK surveys that have recently used life history calendars for online retrospective data collection. So we have the 2024 English longitudinal study of aging, or ELSA, which completed a full data collection wave administering a life history calendar online. Understanding Society, we also know that recently completed a life history calendar pilot and are now evaluating the results. Obviously, this is still ongoing research, so you will find a reference to this on both the evidence review and the survey practice guide, but we haven't got more specific results about this in detail. We have found some other interesting applications, which in any case show that this information is possible to collect through life history calendars. So we have the sexual health and behavior of young people survey in Switzerland, a pilot study also in Switzerland as well, reported in that paper there. A life history calendar implemented in a probability-based internet panel survey, and a life history calendar implemented in an experimental study on occupational trajectories of secondary school graduates, undergraduates, and university graduates in Germany. So there's a whole range of different applications of this concept of life history calendars that have been already carried out. So we know that it's possible to do this. There's a lot of pros. So event sequencing and the graphic display seems to help reducing the risk of omission. The visual properties of the calendar allow respondents to link episodes across life domains, encouraging top-down and parallel retrieval. Landmark events in the calendar can serve as temporal anchoring points or bonding cues. Preloaded information, this is interesting, can aid event recall. So people have used either answers to previous waves of the survey to preload the calendar, or even answers to questions that have been provided before the calendar in the survey to aid event recall and to help people remember about events. The calendars look great as well, which is another pro, and that visualization definitely seems to help people. And actually, the few reports about respondent burden that we have are not necessarily saying that this is a really difficult thing for people to complete. So that's also very encouraging. But again, the reports are relatively limited. However, in terms of the cons, we have things like the implementation of self-administered life history calendars can require significant efforts in terms of programming and budget. So these are not easy tools to set up, both in terms of setting up the visualization part, but also in terms of how data will be stored and processed and managed so that it can be turned into a helpful data set afterwards. And in a more practical way, due to grid dimensions, life history calendars can be difficult to adapt for displaying smaller screen devices like mobile phones. We know a lot of people these days complete surveys by mobile phones. So especially if we have a long time span or a lot of domains, it's very difficult to reach the simultaneous visualization of all these in just one screenshot, so it might be a bit complicated. In terms of wider considerations, I wanted to briefly discuss the issue of layouts, which is still not resolved. So basically, how do you display the time dimension and the domains? We found in the review of the literature that the left to right time dimension is the most frequently used layout. So we have the time over there and the domains from top to bottom. This can be a bit tricky for, as I was saying, smaller screens. Top to bottom was less frequently used, but it's still a way in which the time dimension can be displayed in the screen as well. So basically, horizontal layouts are generally incompatible with mobile devices or are difficult to make them compatible in terms of visualizing everything at the same time, which is what triggers event recall. Vertical layouts may work better, but only if the number of domains is limited. Again, if we have a lot of domains, we will have the same problem of scrolling from left to right, which in the user experience literature at least is shown to produce more difficulties for respondents. There's plenty of evidence that instructions are essential in the absence of interviewers. So this is not your easy and straightforward question and answering format of the conventional surveys. So we require things like video demonstrations, which can be helpful, especially for more complex calendars. The Understanding Society calendar that I briefly mentioned before has this very helpful video demonstration that can help people to understand what's this about and what are they supposed to do to complete the calendar. But also things like contextual help in the form of tooltips, pop-ups, help menus, and that kind of thing could be potentially more helpful than instructions provided either in the questionnaire or as a separate document, which has been shown that people don't really read these documents at all. So it might be just a waste of time to include them as a separate document. So in terms of recommendations, life history calendars seem to be reliable for collecting events over long periods. However, the high implementation costs, we think that they may be compensated by the higher data quality and more complete data without omissions and with more consistent information. And we produce a series of recommendations based on the literature and based on the experiences that we have reported in the evidence review. So as I was saying, we think that life history calendars should provide clear completion instructions, providing completion examples. For example, a pre-filled event or domain might be helpful for people to see what's expected of them when interacting with the calendar. It's important to ensure simultaneous visualization of several domains in a single graphical time frame, incorporating consistency checks. So asking people, are you sure that this is correct, that this is consistent with what you previously told us? Allow participants to edit responses and ensure compatibility across devices and screen sizes as well. So allow participants to edit responses is really relevant because this could also allow to reproduce the interaction with the interviewer. Basically, you visualize a specific domain and then are prompted to remember that, oh, this actually didn't happen when I thought it happened originally, but it happened in this other month or this other year. So editing is really important to ensure that events are recalled properly by respondents. And this is the format in which this information is provided in the survey practice guide that's on the Survey Futures website. So this is basically the same aspects that we were discussing before. Going back to this classification of methods, we are now moving to event history calendars, which are, again, for the shorter term, but using the same concepts as the life history calendar. This focus on collecting event histories, which cover shorter time periods. They are typically used in longitudinal or cohort surveys to collect information about events occurring in the period between 2 consecutive interviews or waves. But more generally, they can also be used when studying specific time frames, so days, months, or years, rather than entire lifespan. So it's a shorter period. They have been used in several longitudinal surveys, including the National Child Development Study and Next Steps in the UK, the German Family Panel, Growing Up in Australia, We found some interesting applications also published in academic papers. So we have SAGE, who collected data on personal events for university students after their graduation. So it's a shorter period. They are only interested in that period. And this very interesting West paper about collecting information on contraceptive use in a sample of women's health study participants in the US. So there's some examples showing that these kind of events history calendars are also helpful for collecting this data. A lot of the pros and cons that I mentioned for life history calendars are still relevant here, so I'm not going to go over those again. But for this, we think that horizontal layouts can be appropriate for event history calendars, as the period covered is shorter compared to life history calendars. And this could potentially ensure a better adaptations for smaller screen sizes. We found, particularly for event history calendars, although this can also happen in life history calendars as well, that when the instrument is too complex and topic sensitivity can be an issue, this can potentially lead to response breakups. Again, as I was saying, we also see this in life history calendars, but we have found more of these sensible dimensions or sensible domains in this kind of application. This is why it's here, but it can also be a concern for the other method as well. And what we think in terms of recommendations is that compared to life history calendars, event history calendars usually cover shorter time spans for which recall error is likely a minor concern. So if you're covering 1 or 2 years as opposed to 10 or 20 years, maybe recall error is not a major concern. And since the calendars are still notoriously difficult to design and implement, they may not be the most cost-effective method to collect retrospective data for shorter periods, and maybe the survey should think more about using a conventional questionnaire implementation that can reduce some cost and maybe reach data that is of sufficient quality for their objectives. This is what we are thinking after reviewing all the literature that's available. Again, this is an excerpt from the survey practice guide summarizing all the discussion about event history calendars as well. We now move to conventional questionnaires. These are questionnaires that do not include a calendar, but could include other types of aids to help with event recall. As the name suggests, these are a series of questions designed to construct a respondent's life history or event history. Respondents are often asked to input dates to situate events within a specific time frame, which can be an issue, and further research we think is required in this particular issue as well. It may include visual aids like summary tables for feedbacks on that kind of thing, but not calendars in our classification. And conventional questionnaires tend to be commonly used in cross-sectional surveys or when recruiting new participants for longitudinal surveys as well. Conventional questionnaires, of course, are relatively easy to implement without significant programming efforts. Compared to the calendar, it's much easier to implement this kind of instrument than a calendar, obviously. However, further research is required on the best methods for manual date input. If you require people to input dates, there's a lot of research, again, in the user experience literature, but not so much in the survey methodology research in terms of how to ask people to input specific dates. And we have the possibility of incorporating summary tables, which can basically produce a summary of the information that the users provided in the previous questions. These are relatively easier to program and implement compared to the calendars, can be adapted for displays in smaller screens if required. And in terms of recommendations, the questionnaires seem to be most effective in certain contexts, for example, for collecting information about non-sensitive life events in shorter time spans. So if the visual dimension is not required, this could be a good alternative. What we found in the user experience literature, again, about date input, is that it can be facilitated by list layouts when dates are on the proximity of the present date, or calendar layouts for dates removed from the present date. And when not using graphical interfaces, a pre-coded list of months might be more effective than providing text entry boxes for months and years. We don't want to be scrolling for several months or years trying to find the specific dates, so that could be an issue. And in any case, device compatibility must be ensured. And although summary tables can provide some sort of feedback in terms of the information that the user has provided to the questionnaire, there's no evidence that these are as effective to aid event recall as the calendars, basically. So that's a bit disappointing, but there's not the visual dimension helping people to actually remember things across several domains and over time. This is the summary that appears in the survey practice guide that you find on the Survey Futures website. We now move to dependent interviewing, which is a questionnaire-based approach that uses answers from previous interviews to guide question routing or wording in subsequent interviews. There are basically two types of dependent interviewing. So we have proactive and reactive dependent interviewing. In the first type, participants are asked whether their circumstances have changed since the last interview or they have remained the same. And in the second one, participants are first asked about their current status without referencing the prior answers, and the discrepancies are only addressed if they suggest a change in status. Dependent interviewing is widely employed in longitudinal surveys, including the US Panel of Study of Income Dynamics, the European Union Statistics on Income and Living Conditions surveys, but there are a lot of other examples that use this technique for collecting retrospective data. There's a lot of things going on in researching this kind of dependent interviewing. So for proactive dependent interviewing, there's the issue on which type of questions should be used. So there's the argument that the question, is that still the case, may not produce the same type of information or the same type of data quality as the question of directly asking, has this changed? So there's the discussion on which of these questions produce the best data quality. And in reactive dependent interviewing, it's of course important to carry out research on which events should trigger the follow-up question. So basically, these are usually triggered when there's a big variation in terms of income or in terms of employment, especially in these economic related questions that I mentioned before. And this should prompt an additional question in asking what were the circumstances related to that change. The specific events that should trigger these follow-up questions is another matter of ongoing research. So proactive dependent interviewing is usually employed for longitudinal surveys that collect event histories in the interwait period. This is the most common use found in the literature. And reactive dependent interviewing is more effective for longitudinal surveys collecting information about economic variables, including personal income, financial situation, etc. I'm going to briefly touch upon event-triggered data collection because it's been longer than planned, actually, this presentation. Event-triggered data collection is a relatively new method also used for longitudinal surveys, which respondents have been contacted monthly in the interview wait period. So it's basically asking them more frequently, just asking them yes or no questions about whether they have experienced any of a list of life events in the period between the last and the current interview. And only if the answer is positive, they are asked to identify which events occurred and then routed into modules of follow-up questions for each reported event. So this method has been trialed in Understanding Society. Research is ongoing. We covered this briefly on the evidence review if you're interested, and there's also a lot of papers about the research they have been conducting. I'm going to briefly summarize the findings. So the review concludes that collecting reliable retrospective data is possible for self-administered online surveys. The increased time and resources spent on programming and design can be compensated by the reduction of fieldwork and interviewing costs and the increased data accuracy. Life history calendars can potentially provide a reliable method for collecting life history data. However, questionnaire-based approach seemed to us to be a more cost-effective alternative than event history calendars for gathering retrospective data for shorter periods, as recall error may be a lesser concern. I now want to mention some topics that we would have liked to cover on the evidence review, but for which we didn't have enough information or enough research to cover. And these topics, it's very reassuring that these topics are being researched by several groups, research groups behind some important surveys in Europe. I had the opportunity to attend recently a workshop in Germany in LIFB, which covered some of these topics, and I'm going to mention some of them just to let you know which things could still be discussed in the future of retrospective data collection, which we did not cover in the evidence review. So first, as I was mentioning before, there's currently a lack of methodological research and a comparison between interviewer-led and self-administered instruments for retrospective data collection. There are, and of course, comparing different methods for retrospective data collection. There is some evidence that the calendars and all these methods for online self-administration can result in good quality data, and they can be very effective, but we lack this comparison, at least in more experimental terms. So this could be an interesting avenue for further research. There's the important issue of respondent heterogeneity. So different data collection instruments may be more appropriate for different demographic groups based on age, education, income, cultural background. Obviously, collecting life histories for younger people, for students, is a lot easier than collecting life histories for older people, because there are more domains and a longer time span to cover. And also there's the restrictions in terms of how easy or difficult it is for respondents of different backgrounds to complete such a complex instrument. There's older people who have no problem in getting online and looking at a YouTube video, but maybe completing such a calendar, a complex calendar, might be a more complex task, and it could be difficult for them as well. So this is something to consider when designing a calendar. Device compatibility, as I was mentioning, as event retrieval in event and life history calendars depends on visualization. Ensuring calendar tools are compatible with small screens is essential, and it's non-trivial as well. There's the whole issue of data structures. So event history data tends to be more complex than conventional survey data, requires more sophisticated data structures to capture them, to store them, and to process them. So this is another thing to talk about. This other aspect was also mentioned in the workshop that I had the opportunity to attend recently. So one of the more complex things of setting up this kind of calendar is that it's very complex to program computationally and to implement in an interface. So there's the possibility that open source coding and collaboration across institutions could reduce design and implementation costs in the long term. There's the possibilities of what can be done with data integration. So surveys could obtain consent to use external data sources, for example, for employment or education studies, and this could be helpful for data validation of the information that we obtain in the life history calendar. And there's incentives. Completing event histories can be burdensome for some participants, although we didn't find much evidence of that, but again, the evidence is relatively limited. So offering things like printouts of a calendar of your life history or of a CV with the history of employment and education, or other types of non-monetary incentives may help to improve completion rates. So these are all topics that we suggest for further research that we didn't cover in the evidence review and that are ongoing for several surveys collecting retrospective data. These are the references. And I think that's everything I wanted to say. Oh yeah, other than plugging the next workshop we will have, but I'm just going to stop at the moment and give you the opportunity to join the discussion and ask some questions. Thank you.